And for an update on the World Cup, we joined live from Moscow in Russia by correspondent Dan Ashby. Very good evening to you, Dan. Thank you so much for joining us. Now, racism behavior of Russian fans has been a worrying factor going into the World Cup. I mean, racism in general in Russia has been rife for years. I mean, who could forget that unfortunate incident early this year when Manchester United player Paul Pogba was subjected to racist chants? I mean, take us through the latest incidents.
Yes, exactly. You've hit the nail on the head. Racist chants, they seem to come up time and time again. Russia actually received a $30,000 fine for a friendly against France. Racist chants heard there, and that was just one example of many. UEFA has also fined Zenit St. Petersburg. They were concerned about racist chants there. That fine actually went up to about €70,000. And then you had Spartak Moscow, one of the biggest clubs here, their Twitter accounts coming out and saying, "Look at chocolate melting in the sun," referring to players of different colours. And this, of course, sparked a huge outcry. People saying, of course, this is racist, it's completely distasteful. And yet, throughout all of this, the Russian authorities' reaction has largely been to say, well, we don't have a racist problem any worse than anywhere else.
Will you say the latest incidents of racism and homophobic chants has perhaps dented the opening days of the World Cup?
Well, I think there's still a positive atmosphere here in Moscow. Thousands of fans have obviously arrived. There's people out on the streets from all different nationalities, and by and large they're being welcomed, and there's a convivial atmosphere, very friendly. But I think where you're seeing the problem is that there's been such a build-up of the perception of Russia. People are aware of this racism issue. They've read a lot about the homophobia as well, and lots of fans have decided that this just isn't the tournament for them. They've decided to stay away. We know that England fans, for example, thousands and thousands fewer of them have come to Russia. And we've seen far fewer European fans at the moment in and around Moscow. Now, whether they're going to come for specific games, we don't know. But there's a much smaller presence. And then, of course, now you're seeing empty seats in the stands, and people are asking questions about whether people have actually decided not to come to Russia. So there clearly is a racism issue there, and that is getting through to the perception of Russia. And it's something the Russian authorities will have to look at seriously.
And I guess FIFA has to come to the party. And, you know, FIFA hasn't been the most proactive organization when it comes to such issues of morality as racism. What have they responded?
Well, exactly. Lots of people were disappointed with the $30,000 fine they gave to Russia for that France friendly I mentioned. They thought that was a tiny amount, and of course money that Russia could easily afford to pay. Infantino has come out and said that Russia is 100% ready for the World Cup. Now, I mean, I think there's little doubt that Russia has invested money in security and infrastructure and is trying to make a safe environment. But many people feel like both FIFA and the Russian authorities just haven't taken the issue seriously enough, because it clearly is still happening. And it's not as if racist chants have just started happening in the last year. It's an ongoing problem. There was, of course, the famous incident where a coach came out and made a joke only a few years ago about being forced to buy black players, which, of course, was a terrible situation. It led to one South African defender who was playing for the Russian club threatening to quit at the time. So it's an ongoing issue. And yet FIFA, by and large, has said, well, Russia's ready for this World Cup. So the only thing that they have come out and said is, look, we've given the referees this three-step process. If there is racist chants in the grounds, then the referees do have the power to potentially stop the games. But many people feel that no referee would have the confidence to do that.
Let's now go back to what Russian authorities and FIFA has been doing to educate the Russian fans on racism ahead of the World Cup. What have they been doing?
Well, one of the frustrations is that there's this attitude that it isn't a big problem, as I say. So one of the many things that we hear from the Russian authorities is that, look, this is something created by Western journalists to try tarnish Russia's image, to try to suggest that Russia can't host a positive tournament like in the West, for example. I mean, to go back to one of the incidents of racist chanting last year in 2017, the chairman of the club at the time said he couldn't hear any racist chanting, and he didn't know what journalists players were talking about. Subsequently, there was a whole UEFA investigation into it. So Russian authorities have done a lot to say to Russians, look, we have to welcome people and we want to be friendly. There's even been classes where Russians have been taught how to smile to foreigners and how to learn about the cultures and mannerisms of other peoples. But the specific issue of racism hasn't factored largely in educating people because they simply don't accept there's a bigger problem here than anywhere else.
And we could perhaps talk about the Kremlin. What has the Kremlin said? What has Vladimir Putin said about this? I mean, we saw a video message earlier on saying that he welcomes every football lover into Russia and that they should feel at home. And he also, almost threatened us with a smile. So what has he been saying about this, perhaps?
Well, yeah, but I don't think there'll be a smile until we see maybe a Russia 10-0 or a Russian lifting the World Cup trophy. In terms of what the Kremlin's actually said, they've said they've got a zero tolerance attitude towards this and they will crack down on it. And to be fair, when it comes to football hooligans and the sort of far right, the ultras of the Russian game, and many of them, remember, are some of the most racist fans, they have been very strict with them. We've heard reports of the FSB, the intelligence services, going around and warning potentially violent fans that they will not be welcome at games. If they shame their country, then they will be dealt with severely. And so far, I mean, it's early days in the tournament, but so far we've seen no real fan violence, any sort of menacing behaviour from fans to foreign nationalities. So I think that's the main way they've gone about tackling that problem. They've said from the Kremlin there's a zero tolerance, but we haven't seen many policies since these reports of racist chanting. In terms of President Putin himself, he of course said Russia is welcome to everybody, is welcoming to everyone, it's open to everyone, and he urges all Russians to be friendly and make sure this is a successful World Cup.
Now, we do understand that black African students have been disappearing for years in Russia. What have you heard about this particular incident?
Sorry, could you repeat that?
We do understand that, in the past years, we've heard issues of black African students disappearing in Russia. Have you perhaps heard anything about this?
I haven't got details on that, no, but we have spoken to Africans who are living in Moscow, and they have raised concerns about difficulties living here. I think they feel that there is a cultural catch-up to happen here in Moscow to make them feel fully welcome. And sometimes it's not, the most overt things. It's not as if they're being confronted with aggressive racism in the streets every day, just being treated slightly differently, sometimes slightly inappropriate jokes. But certainly a lot of African young players we talk to, people living in Moscow, say there's a lot of catch-up work to be done before they feel fully integrated and welcome in Moscow.
Let's talk about football now. The host nations winning 5-0 against Saudi Arabia. That must have been got local fans excited.
Yes, I mean, that was one hell of a moment to open the World Cup. I mean, you have to remember that there was very low expectations for the Russian national football team. Even President Putin came out and said he wasn't expecting that much. If they could give a gutsy performance, that would be enough. And then you come out and see that 5-0 thrashing of Saudi Arabia. This is a team that many people thought is getting on, is getting old, hasn't been at their best since 2008. The run-up to the World Cup was pretty bad. They hadn't won hardly any games at all in a long time. And then they come out with that tremendous performance against Saudi Arabia. Now, it has to be said that Saudi Arabia played a terrible game, so they were a fantastic opposition for an opening game. But still, some of the goals you saw from Cheryshev and some of the other players were fantastic. Some of them might even come up as goal of the World Cup. So yes, a great start. The question is, can Russia do the same against Uruguay and Egypt?
Good question. That now African teams, Egypt, as I said, and Morocco losing opening matches today must be a worrying factor for African adventure in Russia.
Yeah, it's not the best of starts, is it? I mean, I watched the Egypt-Uruguay game, and I thought Egypt had a good game. I mean, they were holding Uruguay at bay. Obviously, Uruguay weren't playing at their best. Suarez was largely anonymous. He had a terrible game. But Uruguay is seen as the dark horses of this competition, and nobody expected Egypt to necessarily top the group. And Egypt, without the man Mo Salah, of course, they were holding Uruguay at bay. Of course, in the final minutes of the game, they lost, but let's try and imagine at Egypt with Salah on the field, they could do some damage. Even though Russia had that fantastic win, you could fancy Egypt to take them on, and they've still got Saudi. Morocco, yes, everyone was expecting Morocco to beat Iran. This is a historic victory for Iran, who haven't won into a competition like this in about 20 years. But, I mean, I would never write off African teams at an early stage in a World Cup. Many times African teams come out to surprise us and go pretty far, right up into the quarter semi-finals in some of the most recent tournaments. And of course, we've still got to see Nigeria play, and they are generating a lot of excitement here in Moscow.
Still early stages there, Dan, still early stages. But then thank you so much for your time. That is our correspondent, Dan Ashby, joining us live from Moscow in Russia.